So one of the things I would just say that several speakers have said is that it's happening now, and local governments and local officials and local planners, local people are dealing with this now. They're not, a lot of them know it's sea level rise, but they talk about it as flooding. And we are obsessed with flooding in tidewater. There's no surprise. I mean, think about the name of tidewater. It is a region on the water, right? And it is full, it's very branchy, and it's historically flooded. It's flooding more. It's flooding a lot. And this, even going on a further, more local level, this is the tide gauge in Norfolk at Sewell's Point. And you can see, just I think as Ben said, or the previous speakers, we have been experiencing sea level rise. And this top chart is from 1930 until now, a foot of sea level rise already. Over here, if we could really focus in, you would see the past 10 years look like this. And people live with this in tidewater. So the Virginia Institute of Marine Science is the science advisor to the state by statute, in addition to being a research organization. And they were tasked by the General Assembly to do a recurrent flooding study. And I'll talk a little bit about why we talk about recurrent flooding in Virginia. And they pinpointed 1.5 feet by 2050 that Virginia is likely to experience in that time. And I will say it's on top of 1 feet already, and it's 1.5 feet, and VIMS itself will say this is conservative. So when you start thinking about a life of a mortgage, someone buying a house right now will just pay off their home and experience 1.5 feet of sea level rise. And that doesn't mean, I think a lot of folks imagine sea level rise like a bathtub, like it's slowly coming in and we can somehow deal with it. That's not the way it's playing out. The way it's playing out is a lot more flooding. So in The Hague, a neighborhood where I live, has some data about how often it's flooded since the early 20s. And again, you can see this neighborhood has, is averaging or has had years recently of more than 300 hours of flooding. And what this means for people is this is what our neighborhood looks like, and it's not a nor'easter, it's not a hurricane. This is rain plus high tide. There's a school, it gets backed up, people can't pick up their kids. And this happens all the time. And that's one of the reasons why Norfolk Mayor Frame is known in climate circles as being a mayor who talks about sea level rise. He talks about climate change. My understanding, he's the first mayor in the country to talk about retreat, which is, think about that. Mayors live on local property taxes. This is not something they want to talk about, but that is really how serious it is in Virginia. This is another picture of driving to the naval base. This is Hampton Roads Boulevard. It floods all the time. There's also some good data about this road flooding. And talking about the security issues, most of the people who work on the base, this is the largest naval base in the world, do not live on the base, right? I think it's like 90%. And so there are concerns that we do not have people who can get to work in a perhaps in a crisis time. And so simply because the roads aren't high enough anymore. So that's just a really simple example of how a security issue is happening right now in Norfolk. So I want to just give you a sense of recurrent flooding. Why do we talk about it this way? And I've learned a lot from our conversation about sea level rise. I have an environmental background. So at first, when you start hearing we're going to do a recurrent flooding study, there's folks who might think, well, hey, why can't we talk about this more directly? And I think we're getting there. But the lesson or take home I learned is that maybe the more specific and concrete you get, actually the more useful it is to a lot of people who don't follow climate change. They certainly know it's flooding, and that's very real to them. In any event, A Republican delegate, a Democrat senator from the region, got a study passed from the Virginia General Assembly to study recurrent flooding. And they got it passed because they didn't use the term sea level rise. And this made the news. This was made fun of. This was a joke, maybe, I think it was on, I don't know if it's Colbert or The Daily Show. But it turns out that that was a good compromise because it got things moving. And it resulted in this study where everyone relies upon it. It has been this really keystone document for local planners, for state officials, for the working group, for the Secure Commonwealth panel that is actually spending a lot of time talking about sea level rise and flooding. And if you open it, there's a lot about sea level rise. There's a lot about climate change. The scientists have not backed off from what they know and what they think. But to get the study passed, it needed to use recurrent flooding. That was the difference. And it brought along some folks who otherwise could not be brought along. In 2013, the Virginia Coastal Policy Clinic partnered with VIMS to have a conference on legal issues in local government for local governments. We thought we would have maybe 100 people. We had more than 230 people come. 30 people wanted to participate online. We were amazed by the response from local governments of how much they want direction about what to do and the issues that they're facing. And the other cool thing is it was very bipartisan. So we have 3 mayors in the region. They're different political parties. They're all saying, please, we need to do something. We're ready to act. And maybe most significantly, we had Senator Watkins, who is a Republican, also come and say it's time for state government to act. This is a big deal for Virginia. And it's a big deal for him, not just because he's an R, but because he's from Richmond. And so Hampton Roads is really happy that someone whose district is in Richmond may think this. So Virginia is moving toward acting because the water cannot be ignored anymore. And just a few weeks ago, Governor McAuliffe is reviving a climate change panel that Governor Kane had. So I think you're going to just see more and more activity. So what are we hearing? The clinic, we advise local governments. We work very closely with VIMS. And I want to give you a sense of the legal questions that are rising because I think the facts of those legal questions will be the stories you want to write about because there are a lot of values, there are a lot of conflicts, there's a lot at stake. So the questions local governments always have: do I have authority to act? Am I going to have tort liability if I do something? Is somebody going to sue me because they get hurt or I don't do it well? Do I have takings liability? I build a wall, it blocks someone's view. Are they going to sue me because I took value from their property? What about the Americans with Disabilities Act? Okay, you elevate everything. What about those folks? Do I need to evacuate them? GIS, privacy, I've got all this interesting data. How much do I share? It's got critical facilities. I've got this naval base. These are the kinds of questions they're asking right now. And I'm not going to tell you I have all the answers. And flood insurance rates. People are crying about this. I'm sure you followed Biggert Waters and then Grim Waters of how we've tried to reform it and we've backed off a little. Rates will still rise, and more people are worried about this. So really quickly, just to give you a sense of the legal issues, is that if Virginia is a Dillon Rule state, what that means is that localities cannot act unless they have authorization from the General Assembly. That's not true in most states. It's true in Virginia. And why that matters is localities may hesitate before acting. Do I have authority to act? When it comes to flooding, they have lots of authority. So another useful thing about using the term recurrent flooding instead of sea level rise is that sea level rise is not in the Virginia Code. But flooding has historically been local government authority. They have been dealing with flooding for a long time. They have zoning. They have all kinds of things. It's a normal power for a local government to have. So talking about flooding is also useful because they already have authority to do lots of things to deal with it. And the other reason it's a cool term is it actually is in the Virginia Code. So the more we talk about the concrete flooding, the on stronger footing we feel. So another weird question I get, and I have a cheesy cartoon to show it, but it's true, is that cities and localities are between two hard points. They are spending more money to maintain roads and infrastructure. And they think, what if I can't keep up with these costs? It's not fair to all the other taxpayers to subsidize 7 houses that are way out in yonder. Can I stop it? Can I stop maintaining this road? Do I have a duty to maintain? So tort questions are always about duty. Do I have a duty to do something? And you know what's frustrating is the answer is sometimes you do have a duty to maintain services, and sometimes you don't. So I want to give you a sense of like the steps it takes to take action and what folks are dealing with, at least in Virginia. And an important one, you might say, so why? Why do sometimes I have liability for failing to maintain roads, but I don't have liability for failing to maintain flood control? It's because the General Assembly, in its wisdom, or not, however you feel about it, has said, we're going to give you sovereign immunity in these areas. Because we want you to take the initiative and do these things. We think it's good for society, and we don't want you to be exposed to suit. So right now in Virginia, you have sovereign immunity if you fail to maintain flood control. That sounds good. I'm going to move on. There's a recent takings case that pulls that sovereign immunity into question, and it was in 2012. And y'all may know about this case in Virginia where Cameron Run was flooded. It flooded in quickly 14 feet in 2 hours, and the floodwaters were blocked by the Beltway. And the citizens tried to bring suit against VDOT and the county, and they were trying to argue, you know, hey, your badly, poorly built Beltway caused my flood. And there were reports saying this could happen. But they were barred by sovereign immunity. So what did they do? They brought a takings claim. And the Virginia Supreme Court concluded, you know what? You have standing to sue. You can bring a takings claim. And this is an outlying case. I think there's only another case like this in Arkansas, but I bring it to you because I think we're going to see more of this in the future, perhaps. We're really sympathetic plaintiffs. I mean, I don't know if you saw the language, but in the case, it's like the homes were engulfed with sewage-laced water. When you start seeing language like that, you realize the court's really sympathetic to the predicament these folks were in. They didn't have flood insurance. They can't sue in tort because there's sovereign immunity. So it's a workaround, it's a constitutional workaround to maybe give them some relief. Cities are worried about this, right? Because they think, I'm trying to build a flood control wall, I'm trying to do something to help you maybe. I don't want to be sued if I don't do it right or if I don't maintain it right. So you see the predicament of acting and not acting and the kinds of issues that might arise. And you see the predicament of the property owners. This is a horrible situation to be in. Other questions, the disabled. There was a New York district case out of Sandy where the court found that New York violated the ADA because they didn't take into account the disabled for evacuation in their planning. Cities are worried. Really worried about this. And then there's the social vulnerability, and I love Ben's tool, and I'm so interested in it, but folks are trying to figure out how can we deal with socially vulnerable populations? Do we need to take special measures? What should we do? And Norfolk looks a lot like New Orleans, right? It's got similar demographics. Renters make up 33% of the population, and it's in part because of the military. Why do we care about this? Because areas of lower property value are more likely to be abandoned. So folks have rising flood insurance rates. They can't afford it, so they abandon their properties. So the city's worried about dealing with abandoned properties. On the flip side, you might see the city saying, we've got to buy out somebody. Who should we buy out? maybe the cheaper properties. And those cheaper properties might end up being in historically black communities. I don't know if that's going to happen, but you can see how it could happen just because of the economics. And people are worried about that. And I'll stop there, I guess, but I guess the last thing I would say is that a lot of communities are in the National Flood Insurance Program, and one of the ways you can reduce flood insurance rates is to participate in what's known as the community rating system. And so all of a sudden, everybody's interested in improving their CRS class. And you do that by taking certain flood control measures and doing outreach and all of open space and all kinds of things. And Virginia has 285 communities participating in the program. That's how subsidized flood insurance is available to folks. You have to participate. But only 22 actually participate in the program in CRS to reduce rates. So if you have a really great rating, which few people have, you could reduce flood insurance by 45%, which is big. Most communities are here, and they'd like to move at least here because they'd like to at least tell their constituents we're doing something to help you deal with your flood insurance. But only 7% of Virginia communities even participate in CRS. And that's true for if you look at any state. There's not great participation, and there's a lot of room for improvement. I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I hope it's been useful enough for you to kind of see what the kinds of things we're coming up with as we are trying to address this stuff.